Hey guys, what's up? So, following up on our previous Diablo 4 video where we showed a whirlwind build guide and then fought the world boss, we want to pick up where we left off and talk about damage a little bit, because the feedback that I have for myself is that my overall DPS was pretty low. I wasn't killing the world boss or damaging the world boss as fast as I would hope. So I want to understand the damage stat and why my damage wasn't so great, right? So Maxroll is already a well-known wiki for Diablo, but they also had the best damage explanation that I could find, and this is damage for beginners, right? So if you couldn't tell by this video and the last one, the target audience for these videos is certainly beginners, and we're looking to improve the experience when we're doing our initial leveling, right? So you go over to Maxroll, you go over to Getting Started, you go over to Damage for Beginners, and it's going to explain all the different types of damage, right? So we're not going to go through this in depth on the video. I want to keep the video brief and then let you kind of explore this on your own. But what we're going to do is we're going to do a proof or an application of the damage formula, right? So essentially the damage formula is going to be the base weapon damage times the skill percent times the sum of all the additive bonuses times the sum of vulnerable damage and vulnerable damage bonuses times critical strike damage when you get critical strikes, and then times any multiplicative bonuses. So these notations on the screen, this is sigma, pi, sigma. So sigma just means the sum of all these individual bonuses, and having the 1 over here means that you first sum all the individual bonuses, and then you create that into your multiplicative percent. So like, if this all adds up to 50% plus the 1, this would be damage times 1.5, right? And then for vulnerable, it's like you get a free 20% when you apply vulnerable to an enemy, and you sum up all your vulnerable damage. So say again, plus 50%, plus the 1.2, it's a 1.7 multiplier. And then same with critical strike damage. So like assume that critical strike chance is 1 for simplicity. Critical strike damage, they give you a 50% bonus to start with. So for by default, it would be 1.5. Add all your bonuses to it, and then add that up. Say you had another 50% of bonuses. So it would be like 1.5 plus 0.5 times 2. And then lastly, these multipliers here, which the pi notation is just telling you to treat all these multipliers individually. And this is why aspect multipliers are so good, and we'll show that when we get into the formula. But basically, if we have a piece of gear that says 50% more damage from barriers, this is where this goes. It's going to be the 50% plus the 1, so 1.5. So it's its own 1.5 multiplier. And there's many of these, and that's why they're so good on the aspects, because we're limited to 1 multiplier for bonus damage, like plus skill percent. We're limited to 1 multiplier for vulnerable damage, and we have to make the enemy vulnerable, right? So we have to allocate skill points to enable applying the vulnerable debuff, right? So the whole concept of buff debuffs, like from Final Fantasy, right? It's the equivalent of like, I cast haste on myself, I cast slow on the enemy, right? So we have to apply vulnerable to them, and then we get a multiplier, and then critical strike damage multiplier, we have to pump up our critical strike chance, right? So that's just 3 multipliers, and then all of the different multipliers that you're going to get from the legendary aspects, and that's why they're basically the best. And then, times the skill percent or whatever. So there's all kinds of caveats and things like that. So let's just jump into the build real quick. So I take screenshots and I put them in Microsoft PPT. I do this with Magic the Gathering when I'm trying to analyze drafts as well. Just lay things out as images on a PPT deck. It's very simple to go through them. And, for the additive bonus category, this is what we're talking about. So there's 1 multiplier dedicated to additive bonuses, and all of this stuff on weapons is the additive bonus. So the way to read the sheet is you have the weapon name, the weapon type, the item power, and then item level, which is the blacksmith upgrades, and then DPS, which is like the actual weapon damage, the thing that starts getting multiplied, right? And for the two-handed sword, it's the easiest to interpret because it's got a value of 1 for attack speed. So we can look at the high and the low value, the 347 and the 521 over here on the greatsword. And the 434 that's displayed is just the average of the two, right? So if you think about damage as a number from 0 to max damage, 0 to 521, 521 is at the top of your range at 100%. 347 would be at 66% of that range. So you're always randomly rolling between that 66 and 100 for the actual raw damage value, but for the purpose of displaying it, they just take the average, right? So what do we do with all this information? Well, I'm not going to show the full process on screen, but I'll show the outcome of it. So I just copied all of these additive bonuses into a notepad, did it for the weapons and for the jewelry and armor, and then came up with an organized layout of all the bonuses that my equipment is providing, right? So if something has a strength roll, you convert that to a damage percent. So like 18% plus 18 strength. Excuse me, this 1.8 damage is coming from the amulets, but over here, if you have strength on something, you convert that to a percentage. So the 4.8% skill damage, that's from a plus 48 strength additive bonus on my equipment, right? So we just kind of add up all the additive bonuses and organize them, and we can kind of see some categories forming. So like damage that's not really conditional. So like it's damage, it's physical damage, it's from skills, either basic or core or anything really. And then basic and core skill specifically. And this is more of like the targeted actual damage that we're doing. Critical strike damage, which is the critical strike damage and the overpower damage. Although overpower damage probably goes into the additive conditional bonus category. It's dependent. We don't know the exact formula, but we're just trying to create an approximation. And then for the purposes of the calculation that we're going to do, Whirlwind as a channeled skill can't even do overpower damage anyway. So fortunately for looking at Whirlwind, we get to ignore overpower anyway. But it's nice to see the pattern here. And then for conditional damage, we have damage over time, which also doesn't apply. Damage over time for the Barbarian specifically applies for the bleed. So like the bleed buildup is damage over time. And then you have things that are clearly conditional, like damage to healthy, damage to close enemies, damage to CC'd enemies, crowd control, damage to slowed enemies, which is like a subset of CC'd, right? For CC, we can do like ground stomp and stun enemies, or we can do like challenging shout and taunt them. That all counts as CC'd. And then vulnerable damage has to be procced. So for the Barbarian specifically, at the top of the skill tree, there's two different ways to lucky hit chance proc vulnerable against enemies. And when we're channeling Whirlwind, we're going to be hitting them a lot, so we're going to be getting a lot of proc opportunities, a lot of lucky hit chances. So vulnerable could be good for us, and we only need to allocate a couple of skill points to actually activate it. So this becomes the input for the damage calculation spreadsheet that I came up with. I didn't come up with this. I basically took what Maxroll is telling me and then used this as my input into the damage calculation spreadsheet, right? And what this is good is it just shows real quickly how the additive bonuses actually stack up. So I'll look at this version, which has some highlighting, right? Because I'll apply it to the example of my fight against the world boss, right? So I have all of these different sources of conditional damage, and I can't actually apply them. I wasn't going to CC the boss through ground stomping it, right? We weren't slowing it as far as I know. We weren't making it vulnerable as far as I know, right? And we weren't activating our barrier, so we weren't getting the aspect bonus that we had it equipped. We just weren't using it, right? So you can see, like here, the sum of all these additive bonuses, which includes strength rolls on the equipment, gives a total additive bonus of 1.758. So that's one of the multipliers, right? So I put all the multipliers here, and the product of all of this is going to be our damage output. Vulnerable is its own separate bucket. So you take the 1.2 plus the additive bonuses. I converted all the percentages into decimals like you're supposed to when you add this to 1. And then for critical strike damage, they give you the 0.5 and then you add all the bonuses. So you can see what these three individual multipliers are, right? So 1.758 for additive bonuses, 1.557 for vulnerable damage if you make them vulnerable, and then 1.914 if you crit, right? So this is all the contribution from my equipment. It's ignoring like my stats themselves, right? So the character stats from leveling increases this stuff a little bit too, but we're just trying to understand the relative contribution of any of this stuff from our equipment, right? So then to calculate damage, you take the skill percent times the weapon damage times the additive bonus, and then if things conditionally apply. So like if vulnerable, if critical, hit, and then you've got this group over here, which is these multiplicative bonuses that you can activate, right? So all your extra ones. So I would say like these over here are kind of like your baselines if you can use them. And then these over here are all of the on top ones that are coming from either skills or aspects, right? So you can see Berserking gives a 1.25% multiplicative bonus. I had 2 aspects where I could have gotten these nice benefits. And then the best players are using one that insanely gives up to 240%. And that 240% would be a 3.4% multiplier when you actually do the multiplication. So you can see how if you're only using these, you're missing out on a large portion of the multipliers. And that's how people are getting big numbers. So basically what you're trying to balance out is aspects that are just raw multipliers versus aspects that are quality of life. So, you know, if you have skills that need special abilities, you know, you have to balance that out against these multipliers. And then the last thing I'll say is sometimes skills are more flashy than good in terms of aspects. So like the stuff that makes earthquakes or gives berserking burning or makes dust devils, those are all flat damage. And if we go back to the Maxroll damage formula, right, those are treated separately. So the flat damage probably isn't that good. It doesn't scale. It doesn't scale with the multipliers, right? So be on the lookout for things that are more flashy than good. But during the leveling experience, you know, take what you got and have fun with it. Just understand that multipliers are worth more. And then the last thing I'll say, again, is reiterate that the channeling skill does not overpower. So overpower and overpower for overpower criticals, critical overpowers are going to be the strongest hits in the game. That's not the build. For Whirlwind, Whirlwind's a channeling build. Whirlwind also doesn't benefit from weapon speed. So it's a flat rate for the ticks. So in terms of build complexity, damage over time builds are going to be the easiest to get going. They are the less equipment dependent and less special multiplier dependent. Damage over time cannot critical, so you even take that out of the equation. And then in the middle is these channeled abilities, kind of medium complexity, where you have all of your multipliers, but you just ignore overpower and weapon speed. And then lastly is the big hits, the one-use skills that do direct damage that can also overpower, that are also impacted by weapon speed with your ability to kind of keep the big hits coming. So it's a lot of ground to cover. I'd encourage you to just kind of look at Maxroll and read through explanations of damage and armor, damage and defense, and just try and understand the game a little better. So thanks again for sitting through this, trying to keep it brief. I know it's a lot to cover, but great. Thanks for watching.